brothers and sisters, as students, as businessmen, as athletes, as parents, we all require some sort of preparation for everything that we do. Take an example of an athlete, one who runs a 100-meter sprint. He spends 8 or 9 months of his life for approximately 10 seconds of work. And then take the example of an engineer. He goes to school for about 25 years, and then he starts working, or tries to start working, not knowing with a surety whether or not he will get a job. And then take the example of a parent, a mother before her pregnancy. She will read up book after book, trying to prepare herself mentally and physically so that she may take care of her child. Now, brothers and sisters, if this is what we do for our dunya, who is going to prepare for our akhirah? Approximately 1 month from today, the blessed month of Ramadan is to come upon us. And we need to ask ourselves, how do we look forward to Ramadan? Are we of those individuals who, when Ramadan comes, that is when we prepare for it? Or are we like our predecessors, who 6 months prior to the advocacy of Ramadan would start preparing for it? And then after the 6 months that follow Ramadan, they would ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to accept their deeds from them. You have to ask yourself, where do you stand? Now, obviously, for a fact and with a surety, we know that it is our Islam that has caused us to gather here today. And brothers and sisters, I'm here to remind you, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَذَكِّرْ فَإِنَّ الذِّكْرَ تَنْفَعُ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ. And remind, for indeed the reminder benefits the believer. I'm here to remind you that Ramadan is coming close. And Allah's Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, in a beautiful hadith, he said, مَنْ صَامَ رَمَضَانَ إِيمَانًا وَاحْتِسَابًا غُفِرَ لَهُ مَا تَقَدَّمَ مِنْ ذَنْبِهِ. That whoever fasts Ramadan with faith and aspiration, then Allah will forgive for him every sin that he put forth. Such is the blessing of Ramadan. And in another hadith, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam has said that it is during this blessed month of Ramadan that the shayateen, the devils, those creation of Allah that whisper to us to do evil, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala locks them up during this blessed month. And it is during this blessed month that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala multiplies our deeds exponentially. It is through this blessed month that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent down the Quran. Brothers and sisters, I could stand here from now until Isha just mentioning the merit of Ramadan. Ramadan is a blessed month that it is not hidden from any one of us. Then why is it that none of us prepare for this blessed month? Why is it that we go into Ramadan with this lackadaisical attitude, that when Ramadan comes, then I will prepare myself for it? For those of you who have experienced Ramadan before, you know Ramadan is not an easy month. It takes a lot of strife, a lot of struggle, and it has a toll physically and mentally on the individual. Fasting every single month of the day, and then every day of the night, you're praying towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for about an hour. This is not something easy to do. Imagine if you had to do this every day of the year. Imagine how would you react to it. Just like the athletes prepare for their physical events, just like the mother prepares for her delivery, just like doctors and engineers prepare for their jobs, why is it that the Muslims then don't prepare for Ramadan? So brothers and sisters, today I thought we would take a couple of examples of how we could prepare for this blessed month. Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha, in describing the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, she said that he was the most generous of creation. He was the most generous of creation. And he was at the pinnacle of his generosity during the month of Ramadan, such that he was like the wind that blowed through the streets. That anyone that needed something, the Prophet ﷺ was the first one to give out. Anyone needed money, he would give it out. Anyone needed food, he'd make sure that they got it. Brothers and sisters, this is how we need to be. But if we don't prepare in advance for this month, we will never reach such a level. We all know that we have this emotional attachment to money. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala affirms it himself for mankind when he says, وَيُحِبُّونَ الْمَالَ حُبًّا جَمًّا, that they love wealth to such an extreme that it is the most beloved thing to them. Right? And now when it comes time during the blessed month of Ramadan to give for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to take care of the poor and the needy, you will find yourself that you are unable to do so. Not because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala hasn't bestowed wealth upon you, but because you haven't prepared your soul, you haven't prepared your heart from parting for this wealth, from parting from this wealth. Now it is something very interesting, the Islamic concept of savings. In the Western world, or in the world that we live in today rather, it's not just restricted to Western society. We take our money and we put it in bank accounts, hoping that, it will accumulate some sort of interest, by the way, which is haram of course. And then eventually we just expect it to grow and stay there, regardless if we live the next day or if we won't. But Islam offers you an ulterior solution, that we know this life is limited. Whether we live 50, 60, 100 years, it is a limited life and we will part from it. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala offers us a solution to preserve our wealth. And this solution is seen in the hadith again from al-Mu'minin Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha, that the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam brought her a sheep. He brought her a sheep and he said, sacrifice this sheep and give it to those around us, meaning our neighbors, give it to our relatives, and give it to the poor people of Medina. So Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha embarked upon this task, and she gave out the vast majority of the meat, and she left the shoulder blade, because she knew that was the most tender part of the meat, so she wanted to preserve it for the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam came back to her, and he said, Ya Aisha, what have you done with the meat? And then she radiallahu ta'ala anha, she said that I gave all of the meat away and I saved for us the shoulder blade. And then Allah's Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam taught her that concept of Islamic financing and taught her how the believer looks towards his wealth. And he said sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but rather it is the shoulder blade that you have consumed and given away, and it is everything else that you have saved. And then he recited the ayah from the Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَا عِنْدَكُمْ تَنْفُضُ وَمَا عِنْدَ اللَّهِ بَاقٍ, that anything that you consume, right, it will perish, it will disappear, it is not meant to stay. But that which you give for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that is what will stay, that is what will remain. So now when the blessed month of Ramadan comes and you want to increase your hasanat, and you want to be of those individuals that is not disgraced on Yawm al-Qiyamah, one of the best ways to do this is giving in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, feeding the poor people and giving food to the hungry and increasing the ties of kinship with your relatives by bestowing gifts upon them. But you will not be able to do this until and unless you prepare your heart and your mind to do this. I request all the brothers to come forth, inshallah, so that we can, make some room for the brothers who are coming late. So brothers in the back, please come forth, and brothers who are in the front, please come closer towards myself, bi'iznillahi ta'ala. So now, again, this concept of financing and saving our wealth. The one who is successful is the one who will benefit from his dunya for the akhirah, that he prepares for the akhirah through his dunya. So now this small concept of giving your wealth for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, of which the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that save your faces from the hellfire, save your faces from the hellfire, even if it is by giving half of a date in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So brothers and sisters, prepare your hearts, prepare your minds from today. Give wealth for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, even if it is little. And when the time comes, when our deeds are multiplied exponentially and the reward for them is magnified and gratified, then we will be able to give whatever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks from us. Now how was the attitude of the Sahaba radiallahu ta'ala anhum when it came to giving for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Let's take the example of Umar and Abu Bakr radiallahu ta'ala anhuma. That we know Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he used to compete with Abu Bakr to do good deeds. So one day he thought to himself, today with a surety I will outdo Abu Bakr. I'm going to take half of my wealth and give it to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So this is what Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu did. And then the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam asked him, Ya Umar, what have you left behind for your family? And he said, I have left behind half of my wealth. And then at that very moment, Abu Bakr radiallahu